A waitress humiliated Serena Williams without knowing who she was. But what happened next was a lesson for everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching us from. The night was calm and clear, the lights of the city reflecting off the glass facades of luxury buildings. Nestled among them was one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, a beacon of opulence and exclusivity. This establishment was not merely a place to dine, it was a statement. Its patrons were among the elite, a mix of celebrities, business moguls, and those who wore their wealth as visibly as designer logos on their tailored clothing. Tonight, the restaurant hummed with the subdued elegance of soft piano music and muted conversations. The golden glow of chandeliers bathed the room in warmth, creating an atmosphere that demanded sophistication. The air was crisp as a black sedan pulled up to the curb outside. Stepping out was Serena Williams, one of the most celebrated athletes in the world. Dressed in a simple but elegant black dress paired with comfortable sneakers, she exuded an effortless grace. Her outfit, though understated, reflected her personality, confident, practical, and unbothered by the expectations of others. Serena glanced up at the restaurant's grand entrance, the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, and took a deep breath. She was looking forward to a quiet evening, a chance to savor good food in solitude. As she stepped inside, the transition from the cool night air to the plush interior was seamless. The restaurant's grandeur enveloped her immediately. The gleaming marble floors, the rich scent of freshly prepared gourmet dishes, and the quiet clinking of fine china. A hostess at the reception desk smiled as Serena approached, though the warmth didn't quite reach her eyes. Beside her stood a young waitress, blonde and immaculately groomed, her uniform tailored to perfection. This was Emily. Emily glanced at Serena, her gaze flitting from the sneakers to the minimal jewelry, and then to her confident posture. It wasn't uncommon for Emily to assess guests the moment they walked in. After all, this was not just a restaurant, it was a stage for wealth and status, and she saw herself as its gatekeeper. To her, Serena didn't fit the mold. She lacked the polished veneer Emily had come to expect. For a moment, Emily hesitated, as though waiting for Serena to justify her presence. "Good evening," Serena said, her voice warm yet steady, breaking the silence. The words were simple, but the confidence behind them made them resonate. "Good evening," Emily replied, her tone polite but distant. She couldn't quite suppress the faint lift of her brow as she scanned Serena's attire again. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I don't," Serena replied, maintaining her composure. "But I was hoping you might have a table available." Emily hesitated, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. The restaurant was never fully booked. It thrived on exclusivity, ensuring every guest had space and attention. Yet, she deliberated, weighing her options. It wasn't just Serena's casual appearance that unsettled her. It was the confidence, the ease with which she carried herself, as though she belonged anywhere she chose to be. That confidence felt like a challenge. "Let me check," Emily finally said, her tone laced with subtle doubt, as though implying that Serena might not meet the restaurant's unspoken standards. She turned away, leaving Serena standing by the reception desk. As Serena waited, she became aware of the eyes on her. Some diners glanced her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. A few recognized her, whispering quietly to their companions. "Is that Serena Williams?" one man murmured. His companion shrugged. "She wouldn't come here dressed like that if it were her." The weight of their assumptions hung in the air, but Serena remained unfazed. She had faced scrutiny her entire life, on the tennis court, in the media, and even in her personal life. This was no different. Emily returned after a prolonged moment, holding a menu. "Follow me," she said curtly, not offering the warmth or attentiveness that other guests might have received. She led Serena through the restaurant, past tables adorned with fine crystal and silver, past diners sipping wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Emily's pace was brisk, her demeanor indifferent. Serena, however, walked at her own pace, taking in the surroundings. The soft music, the hushed conversations, the artistry in the food being served. It was beautiful. And yet, there was an undercurrent of exclusivity that felt suffocating. Finally, Emily stopped at a small table near the kitchen. It was tucked away, far from the central dining area, where the lighting was dimmer and the noise from the staff was more pronounced. She set the menu down with a faint thud and gestured to the chair. "This should work for you," she said, her tone suggesting she thought Serena should be grateful for even this modest accommodation. Serena sat down gracefully, thanking Emily without a trace of irony. She opened the menu and began reading, her calm demeanor unshaken. From across the room, other diners watched the scene unfold. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged glances. "Why did she put her there?" the woman whispered. "That's where they usually seat people who come in without a reservation, but she didn't do that for the last group." "Maybe it's because of the sneakers," the man replied, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe it. At a larger table in the center of the room, an older couple observed silently. Mr. and Mrs. Carter were regular patrons of the restaurant, known for their sharp observations and quiet wisdom. "Did you see the way the waitress looked at her?" Mrs. Carter asked, her voice low but firm. Her husband nodded, swirling the wine in his glass thoughtfully. "Yes," he replied, "and I suspect it's not just about the shoes." Emily returned to the reception desk where a colleague asked about the new guest. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," Emily said dismissively, loud enough for the staff around her to hear. A few laughed nervously, though one young waiter, Jake, frowned slightly. He glanced toward Serena's table and then back at Emily. "She seems fine to me," he said quietly. Emily scoffed. "You'll see. Give it time. People like her don't last long here." Unaware of the whispers around her, Serena continued to study the menu. She was no stranger to this type of treatment, but she wasn't here to make a statement or demand special attention. She had come for a meal, and she intended to enjoy it. Still, she couldn't ignore the subtle hostility in the air, the way it permeated even the most mundane interactions. The stage was set, the players in place, and though Serena had entered the restaurant expecting a quiet evening, it was clear that this would be no ordinary dinner. The restaurant's warmth and elegance stood in stark contrast to the tension building around Serena Williams as she sat at the small table near the kitchen. She placed the menu down gently, her fingers grazing the embossed lettering on the leather cover. Around her, the quiet hum of conversation and clinking of cutlery continued, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent, a sense that she was being observed, assessed, and silently judged. Serena had been in similar situations before. She knew the atmosphere well. Emily, the young waitress, stood near the reception desk watching Serena out of the corner of her eye. Her lips curled into a faint smirk as she saw Serena glance around the room. "She doesn't even look like she knows what to order," Emily whispered to her colleague Jake, a kind-eyed young man who had just started working at the restaurant. Jake hesitated, uncomfortable with Emily's tone. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said softly. Emily waved him off dismissively. "Just wait. People like her always pretend to fit in, but it's obvious she doesn't belong here." Emily's attitude was not lost on Serena. When the waitress finally approached her table, her posture was rigid, her steps deliberate. Emily placed a glass of water in front of Serena with an air of detachment, as if performing a chore she deemed beneath her. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, her tone flat. Serena glanced up at her, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Not yet. I'd like a moment, please." Emily nodded sharply and walked away without another word. Her abruptness drew the attention of a few nearby diners. At one table, a young couple whispered to each other. The woman leaned closer to her partner. "Did you see how she acted? That was so rude." Her partner shrugged. "Maybe she's just having a bad day." "No," the woman insisted. "That was deliberate." Serena, aware of the quiet murmurs around her, picked up the menu again. She took her time, reading through each dish. She wasn't in a rush, but as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, it became clear that Emily had no intention of returning promptly. The delay was conspicuous. Serena noticed Emily serving other tables, smiling warmly and engaging in polite conversations with diners who were clearly regulars. She lingered at one table, chatting animatedly with an older couple dressed in designer clothing, her laughter ringing through the room. But when her eyes flicked back toward Serena, her expression soured, and she quickly turned away. At another table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter observed the unfolding scene with increasing unease. Mrs. Carter leaned in toward her husband. "She's deliberately ignoring her," she said, her voice tinged with quiet anger. Mr. Carter nodded, his brows furrowed. "It's disgraceful. She doesn't even try to hide it." Meanwhile, Serena sat patiently, her posture composed. She had faced far greater challenges than a dismissive waitress, but the principle of the situation gnawed at her. This wasn't just about poor service, it was about the implicit message being sent, a message Serena knew all too well. When Emily finally returned, her demeanor was no better. She stood by Serena's table, notepad in hand, and glanced down at her with barely concealed impatience. "Have you decided yet?" she asked, her tone clipped. Serena nodded, offering her a polite smile. "I'll have the chef's special, please." Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "The chef's special?" she repeated, her voice carrying a hint of mockery. "That's one of our most expensive dishes. Are you sure?" Serena's expression didn't falter. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied evenly. Emily scribbled on her notepad, her movements exaggerated. "All right then," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But just so you know, it's not for everyone. It's a very refined dish." Serena met her gaze, her calm unshaken. "I'm sure it will be excellent." Emily walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she returned to the service area, she leaned against the counter and muttered to Jake, loud enough for a few nearby diners to hear. "She probably doesn't even know what she ordered. Some people just pick the most expensive thing to look important." J.K. frowned but said nothing. He glanced over at Serena, who was now sipping her water, her demeanor as serene as ever. At the corner table, Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a colleague, couldn't contain her frustration any longer. "I can't believe she's acting like that," she whispered. "It's so unprofessional." Her colleague nodded. "It's embarrassing to watch. She's clearly doing it on purpose." Across the room, Mr. Carter tapped his fingers against his wine glass, his expression stern. "This is unacceptable," he murmured to his wife. "Someone should say something." But no one did. The restaurant, so accustomed to its atmosphere of decorum, seemed paralyzed by the breach of professionalism unfolding before them. The diners watched in silence, their discomfort evident but their voices absent. Serena, however, remained unbothered. She knew that her patience and composure were more powerful than any confrontation. She had learned long ago that dignity was the greatest form of resistance, and as she waited for her meal, she could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her, the growing unease among the patrons who had initially judged her, now realizing the injustice in Emily's behavior. The tension in the restaurant was palpable, like a string pulled taut, waiting to snap. And though Serena said nothing, her presence alone was enough to command the room. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would force everyone, Emily, the staff, and the diners, to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. As the minutes ticked by, the hum of conversation grew quieter, the clinking of glasses and silverware more subdued. The restaurant's elegance remained intact, but beneath its polished surface, an uncomfortable truth was beginning to emerge. And it was clear that the night was far from over. The tension in the restaurant was thick enough to cut with a knife. Serena Williams, seated at her table near the kitchen, remained calm and poised, but the deliberate hostility in Emily's actions was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in the room. The once subdued elegance of the restaurant now felt strained, its polished surface masking the uncomfortable undercurrent of judgment and prejudice. Emily returned to Serena's table, carrying a tray with a glass of wine Serena had ordered earlier. Her steps were slow, almost theatrical, as if she wanted everyone to notice the scene unfolding. When she reached the table, she placed the glass down with more force than necessary, causing the wine to slosh slightly over the rim. "Here you go," Emily said curtly, her tone void of warmth. "Would you like to start with a salad, or is that a bit too light for your appetite?" The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled insult disguised as a suggestion. Serena's calm expression didn't waver, but the faintest furrow of her brow betrayed her awareness of the remark. "No, thank you," she said evenly, her voice devoid of malice, but firm enough to remind Emily that she wouldn't be provoked. Emily straightened, her lips twitching into a brief smirk before she walked away. As she passed the neighboring tables, she leaned toward a colleague and muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "She probably doesn't even know what she's doing here. Look at her, completely out of place." At a nearby table, Lisa, the young businesswoman who had been observing the situation since Serena's arrival, exchanged a glance with her dining companion. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice filled with indignation. "How is she getting away with this?" Her companion, a composed man in a tailored suit, nodded gravely. "It's disgraceful. And it's not just her. It's everyone sitting here in silence, letting it happen." Meanwhile, across the room, Mr. and Mrs. Carter continued to watch the scene with growing disapproval. Mr. Carter swirled his wine slowly, his eyes narrowing as he observed Emily's behavior. "She's humiliating herself more than anyone else," he murmured to his wife, "but it's infuriating to watch." Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression tight. "What's worse is that no one here is willing to say anything. We're all complicit in this." As the minutes passed, Emily's provocations grew bolder. She began delaying Serena's service even further, taking her time to attend to other tables while deliberately ignoring her. When she did finally return, her comments became sharper, her tone more openly condescending. "This dish you ordered," Emily began as she approached Serena's table with a menu in hand. "It's one of our most refined. Are you sure you'll appreciate it? I could suggest something simpler." Serena looked up, her gaze steady. "I'm sure," she replied, her tone carrying an unspoken warning. Emily's smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I'll make sure it's prepared. Carefully." As she walked away, several diners began to exchange whispers. The young couple at the adjacent table, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing discomfort, leaned in toward each other. "This is getting out of hand," the woman said, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of the restaurant. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore." Her partner nodded. "It's beyond rude. It's cruel. She's clearly targeting her." Serena, though silent, could feel the eyes on her. The tension in the room was palpable, and while many of the diners were now visibly uncomfortable, no one had yet found the courage to intervene. It was a silent complicity that Serena had encountered before, a reluctance to disrupt the status quo even in the face of obvious injustice. Emily, emboldened by the lack of consequences, decided to escalate further. When she returned with the dish Serena had ordered, the chef's special, an intricately plated filet mignon, she set it down with a theatrical flourish, drawing the attention of nearby diners. The plate landed on the table with an audible clink, the sound reverberating through the room. "Here you are," Emily said, her tone saccharine but dripping with mockery. "The chef's special. I hope it meets your expectations." Serena glanced at the plate, then looked up at Emily, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. Emily lingered for a moment, as if waiting for a reaction, but when none came, she turned and walked away, her steps more pronounced than before. At the service counter, she leaned toward her colleague Jake, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "People like her don't belong here. She probably ordered the most expensive thing just to make a point. Let's see if she can even afford it." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward Serena's table. "You shouldn't say things like that," he said quietly, his tone tinged with unease. "It's unprofessional." Emily scoffed. "Oh, please. Look at her. She's clearly trying to prove something." Across the room, Mr. Carter set down his wineglass with a sharp clink. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. He turned to his wife. "I'm going to speak to the manager." Mrs. Carter placed a hand on his arm, her expression both supportive and concerned. "Let's wait," she said softly. "Let's see how this plays out." Lisa, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. She turned to her companion, her voice barely restrained. "We should say something. This is unacceptable." Her companion nodded, but his expression remained hesitant. "I agree, but it's not our place." Lisa shook her head, her frustration evident. "That's exactly the problem. Everyone thinks it's not their place." The room's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a quiet evening in an elegant restaurant had turned into a silent battleground, with Serena at its center. Her calm and dignity in the face of blatant disrespect were beginning to unsettle not only Emily, but also the other diners, who were forced to confront their own inaction. As the tension reached its peak, Serena lifted her fork and knife and began to eat, her movements deliberate and composed. She refused to let the hostility around her ruin her evening. Her presence, her poise, and her unwavering confidence spoke louder than any words could. But the night was far from over. The simmering conflict had reached a boiling point, and it was clear that the fragile veneer of the restaurant's elegance was about to crack. The quiet hum of conversation in the restaurant was no longer the soothing melody of elegance. It had transformed into a low murmur of unease. Emily's repeated provocations and the unshakable calm of Serena Williams had drawn the attention of nearly every diner. Whispers filled the room, glances darting toward Serena's table and then to Emily, who stood at the service counter, her confidence bordering on arrogance. Serena continued to eat her meal in silence, the glistening filet mignon before her as meticulously prepared as the atmosphere of the restaurant had once been. She chewed slowly, savoring the dish, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She was acutely aware of the tension in the room but chose to focus on her food. Her calm was not a submission but a quiet defiance, an unspoken statement that she would not allow anyone to diminish her. Meanwhile, Emily leaned against the counter, watching Serena out of the corner of her eye. She smirked to herself, convinced she had succeeded in making her point. "She's probably regretting coming here now," she muttered to Jake, her colleague. Jake frowned, his discomfort growing with each passing moment. "Emily, you're taking this too far," he said quietly, glancing nervously at Serena. "What if she says something to the manager?" Emily scoffed. "And say what? That she felt unwelcome? Please. People like her come in here to play victim and get attention. She'll leave soon enough." At that moment, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged from his office near the back of the dining area. A tall man with a neatly pressed suit and an air of authority, he scanned the room with practiced precision. His eyes landed on Serena's table, and he froze for a moment. Recognition flickered across his face, quickly replaced by concern. Mr. Thompson moved briskly through the restaurant, weaving between tables until he reached Serena. He paused for a moment, composing himself, and then spoke, his voice low but filled with respect. "Miss Williams, it's an absolute honor to have you here with us tonight," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I apologize if there's been any delay or inconvenience." His words hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. The murmurs ceased, and a stunned silence fell over the room. Diners who had been whispering about Serena now stared openly, their expressions a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. Emily, standing behind the counter, froze, her smirk vanishing in an instant. Serena looked up from her meal, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone carrying no malice but resonating with quiet authority. Mr. Thompson glanced around, his gaze landing on Emily. His face hardened as he noted her pale complexion and the tray she gripped tightly in her hands. "Emily," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "A moment, please." Emily hesitated, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the room's scrutiny. She stepped forward reluctantly, her head lowered. "Yes, Mr. Thompson?" He gestured for her to follow him to a discreet corner of the restaurant. The tension in the room remained thick as they walked away, whispers beginning to ripple through the diners once more. "That's Serena Williams," one diner murmured, his voice tinged with awe. "How did no one recognize her?" "She didn't come here to flaunt who she is," another replied, her tone filled with regret. "And look how she's been treated." At the corner table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter exchanged knowing looks. "I knew it," Mr. Carter said, his voice low. "That kind of composure isn't ordinary." Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's shameful how they've treated her, but look at her. She hasn't let it faze her for a moment." Emily and Mr. Thompson returned to the dining area a few moments later. Emily's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. She avoided Serena's gaze as she moved to the counter, where she busied herself with meaningless tasks, clearly shaken. Mr. Thompson approached Serena once more, his posture humble. "Miss Williams, please allow me to personally ensure the rest of your evening is flawless." If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let me know." Serena nodded, her demeanor unchanging. "Thank you, but I'd like to finish my meal in peace." "Of course," Mr. Thompson said, bowing slightly before stepping back. As the manager walked away, Serena resumed eating, her calm exterior unchanged. But the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted irrevocably. Guests who had remained silent throughout the ordeal now felt the weight of their inaction. Conversations resumed, but they were subdued, laced with guilt and discomfort. Emily, now standing behind the counter, was no longer the confident gatekeeper she had imagined herself to be. Her mind raced with regret and fear. She replayed every dismissive comment, every sarcastic remark she had made, and felt the heavy burden of knowing she had humiliated herself more than anyone else. Lisa, the young businesswoman who had been observing everything from her table, leaned toward her companion. "That's what it took for people to see what was happening," she said, her voice filled with quiet frustration. "Her fame. If she were anyone else—" Her companion nodded, his expression grim. "It shouldn't have taken this much, but maybe now people will think twice." At the end of her meal, Serena placed her napkin gently on the table and stood. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as she moved toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate. Every head turned to watch her, and a few diners offered quiet nods of respect. As she reached the exit, Serena paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the diners, the staff, and finally Emily, who stood frozen behind the counter. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any confrontation could have. It was a silence filled with shame, reflection, and the undeniable realization that they had all witnessed something profound. Serena's presence had exposed the cracks in the restaurant's polished facade, forcing everyone to confront their own biases and the injustice that had played out before them. And while Serena had left the building, the lesson she imparted lingered, heavy and inescapable. The night was far from over for those who remained inside. The restaurant, once a haven of quiet luxury, now felt different. The chandeliers still sparkled, and the soft hum of conversation returned, but it was laced with tension and quiet introspection. Serena Williams' departure had left a palpable void, and the echo of her composed demeanor lingered in every corner. The diners who had watched the events unfold couldn't shake the discomfort gnawing at their consciences. They had witnessed not just a breach of professionalism, but a stark reminder of the prejudices that quietly persist in even the most refined spaces. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands trembling as she adjusted the cutlery on a silver tray. Her usual confidence had dissolved into a cloud of regret and humiliation. Every action she had taken tonight replayed in her mind like a broken record. She thought of the smirk she had worn, the dismissive tone she had used, the cruel comments she had whispered. And now she understood the weight of it all. Across the room, Jake, the young waiter, glanced at Emily with a mixture of pity and frustration. He had seen her behavior from the beginning, had heard her cutting remarks, and had chosen to stay silent. He now regretted his own inaction. Summoning his courage, he approached her cautiously. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm, "you need to apologize." Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "Apologize?" she whispered harshly. "To who? She's gone." Jake shook his head. "Not just to her, to everyone. They all saw what you did." Emily's gaze darted around the room. She saw the diners casting furtive glances her way, their faces a mixture of disapproval and discomfort. She felt as though the walls of the restaurant were closing in, the weight of judgment pressing down on her. At the central table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter observed the scene with quiet intensity. Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think she's learned anything?" he asked his wife. Mrs. Carter sipped her wine slowly before responding. "It's hard to say," she replied, "but if she hasn't, tonight will haunt her. You can't treat people like that and walk away unchanged." Lisa, the young businesswoman seated nearby, turned to her companion, her frustration evident. "She should be fired," Lisa said bluntly. "This kind of behavior has no place here, or anywhere." Her companion nodded but remained measured. "True, but maybe this is a chance for her to learn. Public humiliation is a powerful teacher." The room had shifted into a collective reckoning. The diners began to talk quietly amongst themselves, sharing their discomfort and reflecting on their own roles in what had transpired. Many admitted, in hushed tones, that they had recognized the injustice from the start but had chosen to remain silent. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, stood near the service counter, his face a mask of professionalism hiding a storm of emotions. He had spent years cultivating the restaurant's reputation as a place of elegance and refinement, and tonight's events threatened to undo that work. He knew he couldn't let the night end without addressing what had happened. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, clearing his throat to gather the staff's attention. "Everyone, please gather in the main dining area," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The staff exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, forming a semicircle near the center of the room. Emily lingered at the edge, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jake stood beside her, his expression resolute. The diners watched in silence, their curiosity piqued. Some leaned forward in their chairs, eager to see how the manager would handle the situation. Others exchanged knowing looks, their thoughts aligned. Accountability was overdue. Mr. Thompson began to speak, his voice calm but tinged with disappointment. "Tonight, we failed," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This restaurant prides itself on being a place of elegance, but true elegance is not just about the decor or the food, it's about the way we treat every person who walks through those doors." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily flinched but didn't look up. Jake glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. Mr. Thompson continued, his tone growing more resolute. "We judged a guest tonight not by her character, but by her appearance. We allowed biases to dictate our actions, and in doing so, we not only disrespected one of the most accomplished women in the world, but we also disrespected ourselves." The room was silent, save for the faint clinking of glasses as a few diners set down their drinks. Lisa nodded subtly, her expression one of approval. The Carters exchanged a look of agreement. Mr. Thompson turned to Emily, his voice softening. "Emily, I won't ask you to explain yourself. Your actions tonight spoke for themselves, but I will ask you this. What have you learned?" Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, and for a moment, she wanted to run, to escape the crushing shame. But she knew she couldn't. She owed an explanation, not just to Mr. Thompson, but to everyone who had witnessed her behavior. Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath. "I let my assumptions guide me. I thought—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I thought I was protecting the restaurant's image, but instead I tarnished it." Her admission was met with a murmur of approval from some diners. Mr. Carter leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's starting to get it." Emily continued, her voice trembling, "I was wrong. I was unfair. And I realize now that respect isn't something you give to people who deserve it. It's something everyone deserves, no matter what. Her words struck a chord in the room. The diners, who had been passive observers of the night's events, now felt a collective sense of responsibility. Some nodded, others looked down, ashamed of their own silence. Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Emily. Acknowledging your mistake is the first step, but change requires action, and that action starts now." He turned to the diners, his gaze steady. "To our guests, I want to apologize on behalf of the restaurant. Tonight, we fell short of the standards we strive to uphold. We will do better. We must do better." The room was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, applause broke out. It started with Lisa, her hands clapping softly but firmly. Others joined in, the sound growing louder until it filled the room. It wasn't just applause for the apology, it was a recognition of the lesson they had all been a part of. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back. She knew her journey toward redemption had just begun, and though the applause wasn't for her, she vowed to earn it someday. The night had been anything but ordinary. What had started as a routine dinner service had transformed into a moment of reckoning, a reminder that respect and dignity are not privileges but rights. And as the applause faded, the restaurant felt different. Not just a place of luxury, but a place where change had begun. As the last echoes of applause faded into the gentle hum of conversation, the restaurant settled into a tentative calm. The staff dispersed quietly, returning to their duties with a newfound sense of awareness. Emily, though still shaken, had a different demeanor now, her usual brisk confidence replaced with a quieter, more introspective air. She moved carefully, avoiding eye contact with the diners, her mind replaying the events of the evening over and over. At her usual table, near the center of the room, Mrs. Carter glanced at her husband, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'll change?" she asked softly, nodding toward Emily, who was clearing a nearby table. Mr. Carter sipped his wine slowly before responding. "That depends," he said. "Admitting fault is one thing, acting on it is another." Lisa, seated a few tables away, shared a similar sentiment with her dining companion. "It's not enough to apologize," she said. "She has to learn from this. Otherwise, it's meaningless." Her companion nodded, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the harshest experiences. Let's hope tonight was enough to open her eyes." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Mr. Thompson stood with the staff in the kitchen, addressing them in a firm but compassionate tone. "Tonight was difficult," he began, his gaze moving from one staff member to another. "But it was also an opportunity, a chance to reflect on who we are as a team and what this restaurant represents." He paused, letting his words sink in. La Lumiere isn't just a place for fine dining. It's a place where people come to feel valued, respected, and welcome. If we fail at that, no amount of chandeliers or gourmet dishes can make up for it. The staff nodded silently, the gravity of his words evident in their expressions. Even the chefs, who rarely left the sanctuary of the kitchen, listened intently, understanding that the lesson extended beyond the dining area. Emily stood at the edge of the group, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her, a heavy mix of shame and determination. She knew Mr. Thompson's words were for everyone, but they felt directed at her, and rightly so. After dismissing the staff to their duties, Mr. Thompson pulled Emily aside. "Emily," he began, his tone measured but serious, "you've been with us for 3 years. In that time, you've proven yourself to be hard-working and capable. But tonight, you let your judgment cloud your professionalism." Emily looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, sir. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I was protecting the restaurant's image." Mr. Thompson shook his head. Protecting the restaurant's image doesn't mean judging people by their appearance. It means treating everyone with the same respect and care, no matter who they are. Do you understand that? She nodded, swallowing hard. "I do, now, and I'm sorry. Truly." Mr. Thompson studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "Everyone makes mistakes, Emily. What matters is how you move forward. Prove to me, and to yourself, that you've learned from this. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Emily said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "Good," he replied. "Then let's move forward. Together." As the night drew to a close and the last of the diners departed, the restaurant fell into a quiet stillness. The staff began their nightly routines of cleaning and resetting the space, their movements slower than usual, as though the weight of the evening lingered in the air. At the corner of the dining room, Emily stood alone, wiping down a table. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was far from the task. She thought of Serena Williams, her grace, her composure, her quiet strength. Emily had spent the evening trying to undermine her, but in the end, it was Serena who had held all the power. Not through force or anger, but through dignity and self-assurance. Jake approached her cautiously, carrying a tray of silverware. "Hey," he said softly. Emily glanced at him, her expression weary. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, setting the tray down. She hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I don't know how to fix this." Jake gave her a small smile. "You already started. You admitted you were wrong. That's more than most people would do." Emily sighed. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It's a start," Jake said, "and the rest, that's up to you." Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know how long it would take to rebuild her confidence or her reputation, but she was determined to try. Outside, the city was quiet, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Serena Williams walked down the sidewalk, her pace unhurried. She thought about the evening, about the subtle and overt prejudices she had faced, and the quiet victory she had claimed simply by refusing to be diminished. As she rounded a corner, she paused for a moment, glancing back at the restaurant. Its glowing windows stood as a stark reminder of the lessons it had provided, not just for Emily, but for everyone inside. Serena knew that her presence had sparked something, a ripple that would extend far beyond the confines of that room. She turned back toward the street, a faint smile playing on her lips. The fight against prejudice and judgment was far from over, but tonight she had made a difference. And sometimes that was enough. The story of La Lumiere and the lessons it had taught would remain etched in the minds of all who had been present. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a place where change had begun, one quiet act of resilience at a time. Thank you for watching. If you liked this story, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends to discuss important topics together. And don't forget to watch our other videos. There are even more stories that may interest you. See you in the next video.